doctoral candidate of psychology. So we were talking about a lot of things like this, like negative thoughts and your neural pathways and things.
Mhm.
But one of the things that just came up for me is, so if two people were both in a house fire, one person can come out of that and seemingly be okay, quote unquote,
Mhm.
okay, and another person can have like a severe PTSD
Mhm.
type response. Like, how does that work?
So I'll start by saying we're very complex. Okay, so as humans, as animals, we have a complexity to us that you know basically no other animal species that we know of on this planet has the brain that we have, right? So there's lots of different things that happen, and so sometimes this can be going to just temperament, in that like your personality, some of the genetics that we have and in the basics of who we are that are not necessarily things that can be um, changed by nurturing in that sense. If we talk about that nature versus nurture, we're a combination of those two things. So we have genetics and DNA and all the things that we are essentially given right at birth. And then the other side of, as we are developing, the different things that happen to us, the experiences that happen, the relationships that are gained and built, and how those things. And so even if you think about twins, identical twins, there are still differences in experiences and how they relate, their personalities and things like that, right? So there's not necessarily like one specific thing that is going to cause somebody to have PTSD versus somebody not, given those situations. But some of how we think about those things, if we have a tendency to ruminate, if we have a tendency to ruminate on the negative, and those things become bigger and bigger, those things can sometimes develop into a PTSD. If we don't have anybody where we didn't talk about it, we didn't get debriefed, we didn't have anybody really meeting our needs, maybe either in the moment or right after, very soon after. So if you think about military and our first responders and things, we talk about how to debrief and how they should be debriefed. Now, I won't go down that path. I think there's still a lot of improvement needed there, but debriefing is a part of it. So it allows our body to actually process some of the things that have happened. Usually, if we process them sooner rather than later, we're helping to prevent a long-term effect. Our body has a normal response in that our neural pathways, our nervous system has what we essentially need for survival, right? So our survival mode and our survival responses are meant to react very quickly in situations like this, where if something like a house fire, or we're being chased by a bear in the woods or something like that, right? We're meant to respond very quickly without a lot of thought process, without a lot of rationalizing. Our survival mode responses kick in, which is good, which is what we want. But what we also want is for them shortly after to be able to go back to a baseline normal for us. We don't want to stay in that heightened response for a long period of time. Now, in saying this, I'm going to revert back to talking about the complex trauma. When we talk about complex trauma, part of that process is, if we are going through something in childhood, adolescence, or in a way where we cannot get away from it. So if you think about being in a household that may be neglectful, there is a dichotomy in the situation that happens throughout childhood and adolescence that we don't have control over. We don't have the power in situations as children to get ourselves out of it. So if there are things going on in a home setting where the needs are not being met, or there's abuse happening in some way, then it can be a whole slew of things, right? But the essential issue in this is that you have a child that is stuck in a place where they're dependent on the parents or guardians, the adults in their life, for shelter, for food, for clothes, for water, for resources, for medical care, all of these things, right? So they're essentially in need of those things consistently. And that's just the basics, right? We're not even getting into necessarily emotional stuff. But what happens is that in that they're dependent, but also this is the same place that is causing harm or pain or not getting their needs met. And it creates this dichotomy of the things that I do or trying to fix these things and make them better don't work, right? And so there's also beliefs then that develop in the like, I don't matter. The things that I do don't work. So it becomes I'm helpless. It doesn't matter what I do. So that connecting factor in that, is that we all go through stuff, is just normal humans, normal things happen, things that are out of our control, accidents happen, right? So we all go through things, but part of going through those is also the recovery in that, and the recovery in relationships, and so part of that is if you have relationships with parents who maybe don't ever apologize or don't ever come to talk through some things or have, their own stuff going on, because a lot of times we see generational things happening that if things happen for them, a lot of times it plays out in their own relationships and their own parenting, which is sometimes, difficult in nature, because as much as I think we don't want to, I think a lot of us have if those things happen to us that we didn't like, we don't want to do them to others. Unfortunately, a lot of times that still tends to happen. And we see the generational pattern continue in a lot of ways. So I don't even know if I answered your question, because I think I just got off topic and went back to my little.
I think that really makes sense. So if somebody goes through the same thing and maybe one person walks away from it with PTSD or PCSD symptoms, it all really goes back to that, like from a young age, how they were treated, how they acted, what they went through. And it's just very complex, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I kind of I never heard about this debrief type situation. So it's almost like I feel like there's definitely a scientific aspect to it, obviously, and like your brain and how that works. But also I feel like if you don't debrief from a situation, you might just be able to talk yourself out of the severity of it, or like, does that make sense? I feel like there's a lot of reasons why that's important. And I can just see if somebody went through a situation and they were like, okay, nobody, like, I'm still in this fight or flight mode, and maybe it wasn't that bad, like, so what other reasons would you do that type of debrief, and who qualifies as a person to do that? Like, that's not necessarily therapy, right? Like, does that make sense?
There could be therapists that debrief, but a lot of times we have crisis response teams. So we have Red Cross people all over the world, right? So majority of them, if there's a mental health aspect that they're responsible for, they're going to be trained in crisis management and responding to crisis situations. And basically we know that, right, when things happen, the quicker a recovery is able to be done in a situation where people are able to recoup and people are able to get back to somebody that is emotionally supportive. So if we talk about children in the aspect of going through something, the quicker that we are able to get them to somebody that they are emotionally connected to for safety, the better they are going to do. And so a lot of that is relational in the sense that we feel better when we have somebody that we can depend on or that we know is safe, right? They love us, they care about us. And so there's part of that in the like thinking about debriefing. It's not always necessarily like what this random person who's the crisis person is doing. It is their knowledge of, we need to get this person to a safe place. We need to get this person back connected with somebody. Some of the debriefing, when you think about military and our first responders, is them being able to share in the experience and process these things together and allow for, if something terrible really just happened, if somebody was lost in like a bombing or an accident or something that happened, like for them to be able to come together, because part of this is grief, part of this is mourning, part of this is the reality that somebody on their team didn't make it, but they did, right? And so sometimes we talk about survivor's guilt, right? There's so much complexity in these things that can occur, but the quicker we respond to them and the more response and the more needs that are being met early on, the better the long-term benefits are. And we see less impact long-term in that, so that they're able to heal and process those things. One thing I'll touch on is that when I first started talking about the brain and the body, in the interconnectedness of that, is that one of the things that we are now much more aware of is that being aware of things cognitively and knowing them is not the same as being able to recover from them in the sense of our body. So our body experiences things with us cognitively, but also differently from us. And so it's one of those pieces that being able to connect that and allow the body to process those things as well. One of the things I've been reading a book recently, and I actually love how the author talks about memory and how we tend to talk about memory only in one sense, and it's not actually the full understanding of actual memory. So when we talk about memory, we talk about it in the sense that like we remember and we recall things, right? Well, that's our explicit memory. So our explicit memory are things that we can think back and we're like, oh yes, I remember that when I was, 7 years old and I fell flat on my face and broke my tooth. I remember that. True story. But our implicit memory is things that have happened to us and to our body, to our brain, but that we don't necessarily remember or can recall. So there's two things kind of going on. And so when people come in for therapy, when people come in, and, we're talking a lot about trauma today, but I think I have seen I don't even know how many people, I've seen hundreds of people come into my office and say, I'm sad or I'm depressed and I don't know why. Or I'm anxious all the time and I don't know why, right? So there's a lot connected to that. But when we go to this place of the things that have happened to us impact us, and if we can't remember them, but they've happened, there's somewhere in this implicit memory, right?